We're joined now by former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Mr. Blair, welcome to Closing Bell. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Will.
So in this meeting today, just some brief comments we've had out of it already. The President said that he hopes to work something out on a fair trade deal with Europe. Do you think that's likely to materialise in the near future? And if it does, would it justify the tactics he's employed to get to this point?
Well, I think it all depends whether the purpose of the tactics is to put the issue on the table and then get a resolution, or whether it signals, a more profound shift in policy towards economic nationalism. If it's the first, I think it can be dealt with. If it's the second, obviously it will trigger a series of reactions that will be unfortunate. But I'm hoping it is the first. I mean, there are real trade issues between the US and the EU, between the US and China, and these are things that's perfectly reasonable to want to work out. It's just they've got to be done in a way that doesn't end up causing a problem in the whole global trading system.
Does the President have a point when he suggests in various comments and tweets that the EU is quite hard to negotiate with?
Well, the EU is going to look after its interests in the way that America will look after its interests, and that's perfectly natural. But I think the key thing for me is whether you're adjusting the terms of trade in order that you deal with certain grievances that both sides may have about the practices of the other, or whether you're embarking on a new approach to the global trading system. Now, that would really worry me. If that was the case and we were about to see a descent into a sort of spiral downwards into a trade war, that would obviously be a huge problem for the world economy. I don't think that's what the US is trying to do, and it's certainly not what Europe wants. So let's give it a chance to work. And by the way, Jean-Claude Juncker, obviously I know extremely well, has got 30, 40 years experience of dealing with these issues.
I wonder, though, if he has the backing of all 28 leaders that are in the European Union. And what do you think about this tactic of imposing unilateral tariffs in the name of national security as a negotiating tool to derive better trade deals?
Yeah, well,
is that going to work?
Well, people are going to ask whether that indicates there's going to be a reasonable dialogue or not. The important thing to understand about Europe is it's a huge market, does immense amount of trade with America. It's very important that it protects that market, but he will have the full backing of the European Union in taking a reasonable but still tough stand. And he'll want to make sure he's representing European interests properly.
Let's move on and talk about Russia. Many people wonder whether President Trump is underestimating Russia and President Putin. When President Putin first came to power, did President Bush and you underestimate President Putin?
I don't think we underestimated him, but I think at that time when I first got to know President Putin, I think we very much hoped that we could create a cooperative atmosphere between the West and a changed Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And for whatever reason, that didn't materialize. And today, I think President Putin regards himself very much in competition with the West. Now, there are certain areas where we still have to cooperate in the fight against terrorism, for example. Then there are other things that Russia is doing where the West has got to take a clear and principled stand. And so I think, again, the question is, the West and the alliance of Western nations in NATO, that is an alliance of interests, but it's also an alliance of values. And it's important that we're clear that those values are going to be protected. Now, whatever people say about the recent summit between President Trump and President Putin, if you look on the ground, as the Secretary General of NATO was explaining to me last week, actually America has stepped up its defense commitments to Eastern Europe, which is a good thing, by the way. So, again, let's leave aside whatever the talking is and focus on what the reality is.
So in that essence, do you think the media criticism of the President's meeting in Helsinki and the rest of the dealings with Russia perhaps is overstated a little bit?
Well, I think it was bound to happen as a result of the way the meeting came out. But in the end, for me, the thing that matters is to reassert the importance of NATO, the importance of collective defense, and to send a very clear signal to Russia that we want a cooperative relationship. Where we need to work together, we should work together. But there are certain clear rules that have got to be abided by. And you've got a situation still in the Ukraine which is extremely difficult for the people there.
On the topic of Iran, clearly the president has taken a very hard line. He's pulled out of the deal that was signed in July 2015 against the wishes of various allies. Do you think that hard line on Iran is fair, though?
Look, I said I would have kept the deal in place, but I do think a tough position against Iran and their destabilizing tactics in the Middle East is absolutely right. Look, I mean, I'm in the Middle East once or twice a month. My institute does a lot of work there, particularly on the relationships in different countries in the Middle East, and you see everywhere the destabilizing impact of Iran. And in a way, I would prefer to see the nuclear issue kind of, as it were, dealt with by the agreement and a real pushback against the other activities of Iran. But I think given where we are now, it's important that we try and build as much unity between America and Europe on the areas we can definitely agree with in relation to Iran, which is their activities around the region.
Let's switch the focus back home to the United Kingdom. Do you envy the Prime Minister's job at the moment? No,
I think she's got a really, really tough job. And I always say, even when I'm criticizing her policy, that I accept it comes from a well-intentioned place. But I think she's going to find that the deal she wants to do now is a deal that, one, won't pass Europe, but two, won't actually pass the views of the British people. And therefore, I think it's going to be very difficult for her to proceed on that basis.
You've campaigned, you think it'd be good to have a second referendum. You've said that loud and clear before. Do you think the chances of that second referendum are higher today than at any point since 2016?
Well, I think the steps to look at it are these. First of all, I don't think there's any Brexit proposition that can command a majority in the House of Commons. So I think there will, at a certain point, or may well be, stalemate. If there is stalemate, then I think in the end the only way that you can resolve this is not to rerun the last referendum, but in a sense to go back to the British people and say, do you want to go forward on this basis, or would you want to stay? Now, I think one other element in that is that Europe itself is looking at the reforms and changes that it needs to make. Immigration was the big driver of this Brexit referendum in the UK. I think that Europe itself knows it's got to deal with its immigration issue. The Italian election tells you that, the recent elections in Austria, all over Europe, this is a big question. So I still think it's possible, and I think this is more likely now than it was a few months ago, that you'll get a benign coming together of circumstance where there isn't really a Brexit that works, that is going to command a majority, and Europe itself also recognizes that there are changes that it needs to make, which are changes very much in line with some of the sentiment that gave rise to Brexit.
I'm curious how you would characterize President Trump and Prime Minister May's relationship. President Trump said it was the highest level of special. Do you see it that way? Was it as close as yours with President Bush?
I mean, I was Prime Minister for 10 years. I had a very close relationship with President Clinton, President Bush. I hope that they get on really well, because it's in the interest of our two countries that they do. And, it's not my job to come here and sort of criticize your president or indeed criticize her. I hope the relationship's special, because it should be, because these are two countries, you and I's country and your country, we got a lot in common.
We have a special relationship.
Well, that's levels.
Okay. Yeah. I won't go into that right now, but well, I don't know what that says about their relationship either. But anyway,
talking friendships, purely friendships.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay. Jolly good.
Going back to the idea of a second referendum very quickly, Tony. Sir John Major said on the Marr show on Sunday that a second vote has democratic downsides, but that it was morally justified. Well, what would you say to the people who were told, first of all, it was a once-in-a-lifetime vote, that voted for Brexit, won the vote, and still want Brexit? Would their democratic rights be bulldozed in the instance of a second referendum?
No, I don't think you can say they're going to be bulldozed, because we're not suggesting anything different happens without their consent. But when you've got large numbers of people who voted for Brexit saying that this deal that the Prime Minister's putting forward, which is kind of half in Europe, half out of Europe, when you get the people who supported Brexit saying, well, that's not what we meant by Brexit, it's very hard to argue that there's a mandate for that, because 48% of the country voted to stay, and of the 52% that voted to leave, it's clear there is a deep division within that group as to what it really means. And in the end, look, my view is in the end it's a very simple thing. If you're going to leave Europe, okay, leave, but understand short and medium term there's going to be significant economic pain. if you're going to stay, then stay. I think what the Prime Minister will find is the problem with her proposal is that it doesn't satisfy the people like me who want to stay, and it doesn't really satisfy the people that want to leave.
And my final question, Mr. Blair, because we're right up against the clock, but in the instance of a no-deal, clean Brexit, does the UK still flourish long-term either way?
If we do a no-deal, sort of absolute rupture with Europe, yes, we can flourish, but we're going to have to do a lot of economic and social restructuring. And my anxiety has always been that the people who want that vision for Britain will pull us out of Europe, but they'll never actually persuade the British people to then do that economic and social restructuring. So if you want that new vision for Britain, which is very different, implies a very different system in Britain, I think that's another reason why this has got to be voted for by the people, to make sure that they're actually prepared to go for that type of future. Because I suspect a lot of the people in the Labour voting constituencies in the north of England, they might want Brexit, but they certainly don't want that type of deregulated, light tax, low public spending future that some of the Brexiteers want.
Mr. Blair, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us here.
Thanks very much.
On The Closing Bell. The former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.